Hello and welcome to another edition of the Not Too Stuffy Law Show. I'm your host, Attorney Justin St. James. For the next half hour, we hope to entertain, inform, and enlighten you. And if we don't, please don't tell anyone else. I'd like to welcome our studio audience. Looks like she's been waiting there for a while. In this program, we'll take a trip into cyberspace. In fact, over the next 3 episodes of the Not Too Stuffy Law Show, we'll explore cyberspace and the internet in particular. A lot of people may think they know everything there is to know about the internet. After all one has to do is get a computer, a mouse, click on an icon, and there you have it. But how does the internet really work? For example, how private are your emails? And what happens to all that information that you type into search engines such as Google and Bing? We'll find out during my interview with Harold Belbin. Harold is the principal security engineer for a company called Visiting Geeks in Merrimack, Massachusetts. Today's episode will cover the first half of my interview with Harold, where he'll explain everything from the basics of how the internet works to the ways we can protect ourselves while exploring cyberspace. And my interview with Harold will conclude in the next episode of the Not Too Stuffy Law Show. Later on in our discussion on cyberspace, I'll talk with family therapist Jan Neeler of Newburyport, Massachusetts. Jan will cover the topic of children of the internet, that is, the effect that cyberspace has on children. So stick around. There's a lot to learn, and you'll have a good time. Here's Harold Belbin. Welcome to the Not Too Stuffy Law Show, Harold.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's start with, what is the internet?
What is the internet? Well, the internet started back in the 60s as an effort for the government to connect large institutions in the event of some kind of a natural disaster or war or whatever the case happens to be. And that was primarily where the internet originally started. Of course, it wasn't called the internet in those days, but it hooked up government, large corporations, and schools. And so then later on, it kind of took on a life of its own when people got personal computers. They now had the ability, they had a terminal that they could use, and then the internet through ISPs, internet service providers like Comcast and Verizon and many of the other companies that have come and gone over the years have offered this internet service, this connection into this big cloud, which is the internet. And the internet really is it's a big, hard to define cloud because there isn't really anybody who's in control of the internet. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what makes it wonderful and part of what makes it very difficult to control. So that's kind of a 10,000-foot view of what the internet looks like. Okay. In more detail, there's a lot of companies that are involved with maintaining it. Oftentimes, companies that you wouldn't even think of. For example, BBN, who was in Cambridge and the Boston area for years, was one of the primary developers of a lot of the technology. IBM was involved. A lot of the schools, MIT, Harvard, places like that. Which is where a lot of the original technology came out of. But the usage was all driven by the academics and in the school world.
So then take me through it. How does it actually work? If we have Google, for example, okay, which is the one that most people, I think, know about.
Sure.
How does Google get to be in existence, and how do they work, and how do they get to be so powerful?
Well, I mean, Google is essentially a type of application or a usage, a service that's offered on top of the internet. The internet is an infrastructure. It's basically nothing more than a bunch of wires and cables that allows everybody to send information from one place to another. So from my computer to a computer that sits in one of the Google hosting centers somewhere in the world, or any other company. There's a couple pieces that are relevant to the internet and how it works. You need a terminal of some sort, so a PC computer, whether it's a Mac or a PC clone or whatever. You also need a web server, and that's where the information actually physically resides. So when I create a web page, there's some code that I create and pictures and stuff, and I put it into a standard format, and then that web server has a network connection. That network connection connects into this big cloud that's called the internet. And through something called DNS, or domain name serving, I can associate an IP address to a name. So google.com equals some address. That address is like a telephone number. Mm-hmm. But because people are terrible with numbers for the most part, and the numbers get so big, it made sense to have some way of translating the number into words, which is what people remember.
So every day, though, I mean, there must be millions and millions of of emails and webcasts going on
Oh,
at
absolutely.
any moment. So then, are you saying that at some point, no matter where it is, comes from the world, there's some kind of physical recording? In other words, if I send an email this morning to
Absolutely.
my friend, somewhere, either at Google or somewhere, there's a record of that email.
Absolutely. There is a record of everything. In order to exist, it needs to be data on a machine someplace, whether it's on your laptop, whether it's on a server at a company, whether it's been captured by a search engine, which search engines we'll talk about more as we start to dive into what are some of the issues of the information that resides out in the internet and how long does it last. The search engines play a really key role in that. And so when we went from having an association between a name and an address, we still needed a way to find things. And that's where the search engines came in. Companies like, way back in the old days, it was Alta Vista, and then the Yahoo search engine, AOL search engine. Microsoft has had several variations of their search engine. I think their latest is called Bing. You have Google, of course, who is the 900-pound gorilla in the search engine space. 80% of the world's search engine work and activity takes place through Google.
Now, even if I send an email,
Yes.
I'll go back. If I received an email and I deleted it, that email still exists somewhere then, is that correct?
It always exists someplace. You cannot get rid of it. Or let's say it is almost impossible. For example, if I send an email from me to you, it is sent in the open, clear text, not encrypted, from my computer to your computer. And what it does is it goes from my computer, it goes through the internet connection, it goes to my mail server hands it to your mail server, and your mail server hands it to you. And so there is at least 4 copies of that email, just in this very simple example. And if I do a backup of those 2 servers, I now have multiple copies of that email. I have a record. So even if I go to the server and I delete it, it still exists in a backup someplace. And it depends on how many backups and how dispersed their server infrastructure is. It could be on 100 or 1,000 servers. So it's almost impossible to get rid of anything.
But then where does all this stuff end up? I mean, does it end up in a building in Google, or does it end up, can someone actually walk in and look through all these files, or how does it?
It depends. If it's public information, so for example, there's really email and web, even though they use the same infrastructure, are somewhat separated in that I have my own personal Visiting Geeks email account that resides on a server that sits in the cloud someplace. And I'm the only one that has control of that. But I have multiple backups. Okay, so the chances are not all email exists in multiple copies, but most will. It's because the receiver has a copy, the sender has a copy, the infrastructure in the middle may or may not have a copy. But there's always multiple copies. When we talk about how long things live on the internet, though, where it really becomes critical is things that we post to web pages, websites, blogs, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. Those places are all cataloged and constantly being indexed and searched by the major search engines. And they save those things for anywhere between 20 and 30 years. So if I post something on a website and I delete it 2 hours later, there's a really high probability that it's already been indexed by all the other search engines, and they will maintain a copy of that in their database for up to 20 or 30 years. That's the part that makes the internet scary. That's why when you say something on the internet, you have to consider, I tell people all the time, I would never put anything in an email or on the internet that I don't want on CNN or on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow morning, because it will last that long and that many people have the potential to see it. Now, whether they do or not, whether we're that interesting or not, it's kind of a different issue, but the stuff exists out there. And that's what they're finding now is, for example, a couple of years ago, I was talking to a reporter at the Boston Globe, and we were trying to do a story on reverse Google lookups. And the simple version of what that is I put your name into a Google browser, and you see all the stuff that comes up. And what was happening 2, 3, 4 years ago, schools and companies were doing reverse lookups of people's names on the internet. And they would find either good stuff or no stuff, or they'd find bad stuff. What you hoped was they didn't find any bad stuff because you actually didn't have anything out there. If you're really unfortunate, though, the bad stuff would be somebody else with your name that looks just like you, and you get blamed for it. And the problem is that the big issue with the internet today is there is no way to repudiate yourself. You cannot defend yourself. There's no way to remove bad or false information. It exists almost indefinitely on the internet. There's been some local incidences where a few years ago a bunch of students posted some information, some conversation, and pretended to be one of the administrators at their school. And this poor person almost lost his job. And it had nothing to do with him, other than the fact his name was used. He didn't know anything about it. He never had any involvement, never wrote any of these things, never said any of these things. And he had to prove that he was innocent. It's not innocent until proven guilty. He had to prove it the other way around. And that's the way the information on the internet is being used these days. It's, in many respects, it's being treated like it's as accurate as a dictionary or as an encyclopedia, which has been fact-checked and double-checked, and we have references, and we know people have verified sources and information. On the internet, there's no such thing. Anything, you can put anything you want out there, and people see it on the screen and they believe it. And it doesn't make it so. And so I think we have a lot of growing up to do with how we use this technology.
So what are some of the ways that one can safely navigate the internet, or is there a safe way? I mean, is it just being aware of who you're talking to? Is it just being aware of what websites you're on?
More than anything, it's about awareness. You need to be aware of what you're doing. You need to, just like in the old days before there was the internet, there was etiquette. There was a way I spoke with somebody and communicated with someone. And there's some things I would say and would not say, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And I equate the internet as to a bar room where everybody's had 2 or 3 martinis, because they say things and they do things that they would never do in front of somebody. They would never do those things in person. But some of the things that wind up on the internet are at least that bad or worse. And that's because there's this false sense of being anonymous,
right,
which in fact, you may be anonymous and you may be by yourself in your room while you're writing these things, but tens to hundreds to thousands to millions of people are seeing what you're saying. It can be found. If I know what I'm looking for, if I know your name, I can probably locate where you live, where you work. I can probably find your phone numbers relatively easily. And one of the conversations I've had with many students and parents of students over this conversation of Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, many of the websites, blogs, where people go in and give up tidbits of personal information. And you may not tell me your last name, but I know your first name. I know what city you live in, because most people let that slip pretty easily. And in the case of many students, they're just incredibly proud of their school. So what do? They put their school mascot on their profile. I could find that person in about 30 seconds. It's pretty simple. And once I know, and the scary part is, and this happens unfortunately, the scary part is I can now find, I know who you are, I know what school you go to, I know what days you go to school, and I know what time you go to school. Because this stuff is all public information. It's very easy to find. If I know those things, and I know that you're a member of the varsity cheerleading team, it's real easy for me to find out when the varsity cheerleading team is practicing, which means I know when you're going there and I know when you're leaving. And if you look at these pieces, this is why it is so important to pay attention to the information that you leave on the internet. Because it may be a very, very small percentage of times that this stuff happens, but it has happened. And it is that easy to put all these pieces together because all the information exists out on the internet. The good news is if you don't put it out there, it doesn't exist. It's not going to be that easy to find. But people tend to get on their blogs, get on their websites, get on the Facebook page, or MySpace or whatever it is, and they can't wait to tell the world how cool they are. And I can't blame them. It's fun. But it requires a little bit of just thinking about what you're saying before you say it.
We were talking earlier about things going on in Europe, about how they're cracking down on Google for giving out information. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah, I mean, you're saying in Europe they're a little bit more strict with their regulations of the web, but in the United States it's kind of like, whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, that's kind of sad because the United States usually is at the forefront of technology, but we're almost always on the back end of security and privacy. When I was doing some consulting work in Europe right in 1999, 2000, during that Y2K phase that we had there, and I was amazed. I was just astounded at how seriously everybody in Europe took security. Far, far more intense about the conversation than we ever were in the United States. In the United States, the first priority is profits. Most companies, it's all about the money. If you want to know what's going on the internet, just follow the money, because that's absolutely will explain most things that take place on the internet. There's a reason why all these companies give all this stuff away for free. But in Europe, the first thing they build into any technology is security, privacy, and control. They don't care whether it's easier to use or safer.
Now, when you say control of the person who's sending the information, or?
Whether it's the person sending the information, allowing access. Like, for example, in Europe, in a company, when you work for a business, in order to have internet access, you have to do what's called a strong authentication onto the computer system to gain access to the internet. And this is a type of authentication that requires several pieces of information. And that uniquely identifies you as a person, not your computer, which there is a difference. Because if I leave my computer like this one, I get up and walk away, who's to say you can't step into my computer and send an email as me?
Sure.
In Europe, if there's no strong authentication credential or process, they can't do anything about something that comes from your computer. So it's a requirement. So if you're surfing porn or you're sending, aggravating emails to people, if they don't have this system in place, they can't prosecute you for it. So they addressed this 10, 15 years ago. They said, you have to have X, Y, and Z before you're allowed internet. In the United States, there was no such controls until the last probably 2 or 3 years. And still, there isn't strong authentication, but there is a lot of filtering and monitoring and logging of all your activities.
Well, it seems like a lot of the literature that I've read, it seems like everything goes to the parents. It's just like, well, you can put a filter on your computer. Make sure you know what your kids are looking at on the computer. Make sure you check out who's sending emails to your child, that sort of thing. But it just seems like parents, either they don't have the time, or they can't, or they can't be everywhere. They can't always be hovering over their kid who's on the computer all the time. So what are some of the things that maybe parents can do, or maybe what are some of the things that kids should be aware of? Well,
my favorite saying when it comes to kids and computers, kids are smart, but they're not wise. And I don't meant that as a negative. It's, we say it all the time. Experience means a lot.
Sure.
And experience is what teaches you how to be good or better or smarter about certain things. Kids are very smart. They're not very wise. They haven't had a lot of life experience. A lot of them have been somewhat protected. Our schools tend to protect our students an awful lot from a lot of things. It's not in the old days where everybody walked home after school and things got squared up on the back alleys. Now everybody's in a bus, they're in a car. They're not necessarily used to thinking about their personal safety or their personal security. So kids tend to be brave and brash. I oftentimes will see a child that knows absolutely nothing about the computer, but they just jump right in, they start clicking buttons, and they're pointing the mouse, and they're making all these changes. And so what happens is, about half the time, they successfully manage to do whatever it is that the parent couldn't do. So the parent automatically assumes that the kid is brilliant, because most parents all think their kids are brilliant, right? So this is what you think is happening, but it's only about a 50-50 thing. You know, there's a saying that says if you had 1,000,000 monkeys typing for 1,000,000 years, they could type, you know.
War and Peace, yeah.
Yeah, War and Peace, you know, just by accident. Well, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Even though they've grown up with computers, they're not intimidated by computers. They're not afraid to hurt the computer. Mm-hmm. And at my shop, I see the results of this all the time, because I have the parent comes in and they have the sad look on their face, my kid broke my computer again. And I'm like, that's too bad, you know. But it happens. And so parents need to realize that it is not necessarily about how strong or how smart you are about computers. Their role is not to be technological wizards. Their role is to protect their children and to pay attention to their computer usage and their texting usage. That should be their role. I tell parents all the time, I would never allow a computer in a house that isn't in a public area. No computer in their room. And I know that's inconvenient, and I know everybody will groan and the kids will go, oh man, what a jerk. I understand, but there's a reason why I say these things. And because every time I've been called in to do consulting work where I have to do a forensic examination of a computer to figure out something that happened, whether it's for the police or whether it's for an attorney, or it's a jealous spouse or a divorce case where, you know, I mean, you see it all the time. You see that there's obviously nobody paying attention, because if you look at some of the addresses and the destinations and some of the information that's on these computers, you know, people weren't paying attention. They thought nobody would know, nobody would ever find out.
And again, this goes back to the earlier discussion about how long does an email or how long does a search last. I mean, so does it stay in the computer itself then? I mean, someone like yourself can come along and see a blueprint or see where the person has been, you know, emailing or texting, that sort of thing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Generally speaking, when you delete something on a computer, it's not really gone.
Mm-hmm. It stays on the hard drive.
It gets a little technical, but the short version, the easy version of it is there's two ways you find something on a computer, or there's two ways you see something on a computer. You either see the actual data itself, or you see a pointer that points at the data. And that's, in many respects, I'm trying to think of what a good analogy is. It really comes out of the programming world and the concept of databases and how data is used. There's physical data, and then there's pointing at the data. So it's almost like taking a picture. I have an object, I take a picture. There's two pieces to this. One is the actual object, and the other is the photograph of the object. It's not the object, it just looks at the object. And so when you delete something on your computer, you're not deleting the object, you're deleting the pointer at the object. Mm-hmm. Now, there are certain situations or certain software that will go in and physically delete the actual object. And a lot of these secure erase, secure wipe softwares or technologies make sure that there aren't any copies, that nothing is left behind. And those things make it very difficult for an examiner to go in and find your internet history. But I routinely do data recoveries for people where they go in and they wipe out their hard drive, and I'm able to go in and pull all their data off that damaged drive. Windows doesn't boot, you just get the flashing cursor of death or a blue screen or whatever. I can still get to all that data. Yeah. It's all there. And you know, maybe 10% of the time you can't, like if it's physically damaged, like if you're concerned about, you get rid of your old computer, you want to know what to do with it. Well, there's two ways. One is you do a secure software wipe, or the old-fashioned method is you pull a hard drive out and, you know, get out your biggest favorite hammer and give yourself some free therapy for 5 or 10 minutes and, you know, pound it into a cube. And that essentially has the same effect. It's a little bit more dramatic, and I recommend you be quite careful because there'll be lots of pieces flying around. But
cover your eyes. Make sure your eyes.
Cover your eyes. Please don't try this at home.
Yeah, wear safety glasses.
But you know, the data resides everywhere, and a lot of these theft of data cases that we see on the internet are oftentimes from people or companies that get rid of their computer and they drop it off someplace, and the computer goes to a recycling center, or somebody picks it out of the trash, and they take the hard drive out and they hook it up to another computer, and there's the data. And you see it all the time. So part of what is slowly taking place, like recently in Massachusetts, they just passed, and it just became implemented on March 1st, in fact, the Data Protection and Privacy Act. It's CMR 20117, and Massachusetts regulations have interesting numbers, but in essence, it required any company or any organization that has personal financial information to protect that information, and there's a whole series of steps that need to take place. What's interesting, though, is anything that's on a portable device needs to be encrypted, and it's considered probably the toughest data protection standards in the entire country, and it'll eventually probably become a standard at the federal level at some point in time. It's extremely inconvenient. It drives everybody crazy. Most people are standing around just completely stumped as to what there is to do, because there's so many things that need to be done to comply with this rule. But the nice thing was a lot of it was good safety and security practices, protecting financial information. So, on one side, the companies were very frustrated. On the other side, as users, as customers of these companies, it makes me feel somewhat better to know that they're encrypting my personal financial information, which the technology has been around for years, but there's a cost associated with security. And in Europe, that cost was built into the project, we were talking about earlier. In the United States, they look at, well, how cheap can we do this? And can we kind of cut the corners on that security? And I see that a lot. It's unfortunate. Not all companies some companies take it very seriously. Some companies are just all about the profit margin. And so they cut back. They don't audit their systems as often as they should.
And part 2 of my interview with Harold Belbin will be on the next episode of the Not Too Stuffy Law Show. In the meantime, if you have questions about cyberspace, the internet, or just computer problems in general, you may contact Harold at Visiting Geeks. Again, they're in Merrimack, Massachusetts, and the phone number is 978-346-4087. Their web address is www.visitinggeeks.com. As we always do, we leave you with the beautiful music of the equally beautiful Sarah Melson. You can find Sarah's albums on YouTube, Facebook, Amazon, and of course on sarahmelson.com. The song is called Happy Endings. Until next time, I hope all of your endings will be happy endings. I'll see you then.
I guess I just never realized how badly I needed to be surprised. You kissed me with your eyes, it was then I knew. Now I'm 1,000 miles away, waiting for the first light of day, and the way I'm feeling is oh so new. And I believe in happy endings, and I only see the good in you. And I believe the world is worth mending. I think that you do too. I know that you're an optimist. You're pretty impossible to resist. And I know you've been used for all your wealth. It's okay, you can take my hand.